Hi, and welcome to the Book Revolution podcast. I'm Tim. I'm here with my co-host, Amanda.
Amanda, please.
Amanda. And we're here to talk about books.
What?
Yeah.
The Book Revolution's about books?
This is a book podcast.
No way. I don't fucking get it.
We're doing a podcast about reading.
Oh, okay. Not burning books.
Not burning books.
Not banning books.
Definitely not.
Okay.
So we're gonna start off here with what we're currently reading.
All right. What are you reading?
I'm reading Five Broken Blades.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What's that about?
The book is about a bunch of assassins trying to kill somebody. And it's the way it's written is from their 5 perspectives.
All right, like each chapter's a different perspective?
Yeah, kind of like a Game of Thrones kind of thing.
Okay. Do you like that style?
I'm not the biggest fan of the split perspective style because I sort of get confused about like who I'm reading.
Mm-hmm.
But the book is good enough that I can get past the that kind of stuff. Like same thing with Game of Thrones. Like I didn't really like, Ned's perspective and then Tyrion's perspective and all that stuff.
I mean, did you get past like 5 chapters into that book?
I got halfway into the first book.
All right.
And then I was like, this is too slow for me. And also, well, the series was out at the same time on TV, so I was like, I'd rather watch it.
I mean, that's a whole nother topic for another podcast, I think, is whether you prefer, which medium you prefer, written or visual.
Yeah. Or, like, do you prefer only one POV or multiple POVs?
Mm-hmm.
The other book I'm reading is a book called How Democracy Dies, and it's basically about how fascism takes root inside democracies and how certain leaders gain power and all that stuff. It's one of those, we're not naming Trump, but it's definitely about Trump kind of books.
Yeah, Tim's one of these political scientists, so he reads a lot of political influenced books.
Yeah. But it's a good read if you're ever interested in that sort of thing. And what are you reading? Well, what of the million books, what are you currently reading?
I think my currently reading book list is up to 7 at the moment.
Okay.
But the primary ones that I'm reading right now, I'm doing the tandem read for books 6 and 7 of Tower of Dawn, or Throne of Glass. So it's Tower of Dawn and Empire of Storms. And you read them simultaneously because they happen at the same time chronologically in the world.
That sounds exhausting.
It is exhausting. It also doesn't help that, I mean, Throne of Glass is another one of those series that has chapters from different characters' perspectives. It doesn't necessarily change every chapter throughout the whole series, but there are chapters from different people's perspectives. And one of the entire books, so Tower of Dawn, is entirely, at least, I don't know, I think I'm a quarter into each of them, so at least a quarter in, it's still all one person's perspective. And that character is just someone, I don't really care for his story arc yet. Maybe it changes, but right now I don't really care. So it's become a punishment book. I don't stop reading books. I finish them, especially a series. I mean, I'm on 6 and 7 out of 8, so I'm so freaking close to the end that I'm gonna do it. But it's really boring to me right now. When I'm over into the Tower of Dawn chapters. So I definitely fulfill with other books to keep my interest, because I can't read that one that much. And I don't get it either. Like, the Goodreads reviews on them are so high. It's like over 4 stars out of 5 for Tower of Dawn, and I'm so bored by it. I think the last couple of chapters I tried to like skim through because I was so bored. I just wanted to get back to Empire of Storms book because that one's more interesting.
All right. And are you currently reading anything else?
Lots of other things.
Well, let's go with one more.
One more? I gotta get back to it. I haven't picked it up again in a while, but I'm reading Joan. I forget who it's by, but it's historical fiction about Joan of Arc.
Okay.
And that's pretty neat. It starts with her as, a young kid before she was a young kid the whole time, but a young kid before she joins the military and before joins the Crusades, and about like her childhood. And I have no idea how much of it is actually based on fact, but it's a really good book. I think the author's last name is Chen, I want to say, but I'm really enjoying that one.
Okay, cool. So the topic for our very first episode is going to be our favorite books. Now, we discussed this before the podcast. It's not going to be like a list of like our like top 5, what we think the best books ever made are. It's going to be what our favorite books to read are.
Yeah, and ostensibly I have terrible taste in terms of literary good works. Like, I don't enjoy reading a lot of them. Like most of the classics, I really don't enjoy reading Shakespeare, for instance. I know it's ostensibly good. Like, I know that he was a good writer, and like his works wouldn't have lasted as long as they did if they weren't well written, but I find them tedious and boring.
Yeah, Shakespeare's not going to be on any of my list either.
Yeah.
Like, but neither is like Tolstoy or like
same.
You know, I think I have one. There's one book on my list that's probably like a super famous author who like is on like this is the best book ever written sort of thing.
I think the oldest book that I have on my list is from the 90s.
Yeah. So
nothing to say that older books are not good. I've certainly enjoyed older books, but my list of 5 is really these are the 5 books that I feel like I would reread more than once.
Yeah.
Like I would go back to and reread, and that's what I think deems a good book. A book that, I don't know, makes you go through emotions and brings you to a place where you're having so much fun with it in one way or another. It doesn't have to be necessarily a happy book, but you're having fun with the book and getting kind of a way to escape out of your world that you'd want to go back to it again. Those are the books that I think become my favorites.
Right. So let's start with the bottom.
All right.
We'll start with number 5. I'll go first.
Okay.
Number 5 on my list is going to be a slightly unusual one, but that's kind of all my books. So, America.
You have an eclectic collection,
I do. So it's going to be America, the book by Jon Stewart, and I guess the other people who were at The Daily Show at the time. So it's written in the form of a textbook.
Okay.
It's a comedy book as an American history textbook.
Okay. So is it like just made up history, or it's real history?
It's
told with a flair of comedy, like the Daily Show would do.
It's sort of both.
Okay.
It's sort of both. Like they mix in real history, but they make fun of history, and there's a little bit of like tidbits that aren't real about historical figures and how certain events happened. I think it's more of like history through the lens of of like a comedy writing team.
Okay.
And it makes fun of a lot of like whitewashing of American history. It makes fun of all of the ultra like America is awesome sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes fun of Canada. So it's really a lot of the comedians at the time were Canadian comedians.
Okay.
So there's bits about like, oh hey, this is how we did it in Canada, and it's just a funny book. They put out a revision of the book, maybe 5 or 6 years after the original version. That's called the Teacher's Edition.
Okay.
So they had an actual historian go through the book and write notes on the side saying, well, this definitely didn't happen, and this is wrong.
I feel like that one sounds more fun.
Yeah.
Like, I think if it was me, the Teacher's Edition would be the one on my top 5, not the original.
It's definitely a funny book, and it's definitely a book that I've read more than once.
All right. My turn?
Yeah, your turn.
All right. So I think I reordered this 6 times before we came up onto the podcast, because I was really trying to figure out which ones were more influential or important to me as the time that I read it, like kind of how it influenced my life at that time or what I was doing. So I dropped this one down. It was higher up on my first iteration, but number 5 now in my official version, the Ross Geller laminated version of my top 5 is The Time Traveler's Wife.
Okay.
It's by Audrey, and I'm not even going to pretend to say her last name, but it starts with an N. Um, and it was adapted into a movie. I forget who played what in it, but it was a decently done movie. The book itself is just, it's a book that makes you feel heartache and feel um, loss. And it's kind of a story about missed opportunities, but not by anyone's choice. It's like missed opportunities because of the universe is working against you.
Okay.
And it's a really heartfelt story about these two, um, these two individuals who, are meant to be together, and they know each other basically for at least the female character's entire life, and yet it's a sad, they have a sad end to their story, and it's kind of a lot of what's the word, like destiny is gonna guide you,
Okay.
and like you can't really
Yeah.
change fate, that kind of a thing. So I don't know, it was a really interesting book, and very emotional book.
Okay. I'll do my number four then. Now, my number four is going to be another one of those weird politics books. It's probably my favorite political book to read. It's called Bowling Alone. The author's name is Robert Putnam. He's actually not involved in politics. He's a sociologist, so he studies society rather than politics. But the book is so influential in the world of politics. It's basically about how since I don't know the 50s, the 60s, how bowling leagues have lost popularity because nobody hangs out together anymore. Like that's the basic premise of the book,
Okay.
and that extends to civic organizations, political organizations. How since the advent of social media and the internet, people are more isolated and they trust each other a little bit less.
Mm-hmm.
And the book is basically about how, as a society, the internet has changed us and we're more globally social but less locally social,
Okay.
and how that affects communities. And it's just sort of like a catch-all book for any kind of like sociology or political science, like why don't people hang out together anymore question. There are particular parts of it that are very interesting, that I find interesting because of my background in politics, such as there's a chapter in the book specifically about how political parties are spending more money to influence a smaller number of people every election, because less people are becoming engaged in politics because it's all just background noise now. And so every election cycle, these campaigns are spending ridiculous amounts of money on a smaller electorate. And how it's a cycle that is just going to fall apart at some point, because at some point, there's not going to be enough people left to care. And they're going to have to figure out a different way to engage people, because the way they're engaging them right now is just turning them off. It's a good book. If you ever want to know anything about how people form communities or what's going on in this crazy digital age we all live in, it's a good read.
I feel like you gave away the spoilers.
Listen, it's not one of those books. Spoiler alert, it's about politics, kind of.
All right. So, my book 4
Okay.
is The Whistling.
Okay.
It's by Rebecca Netley, and it's a horror book. It's actually a book that I bought while I was on vacation in Ireland. And so it's by an Irish author. I assume it's published in America. I assume that you can get a copy in America, but I didn't. I find inherently that, I love horror books when I'm in the mood for it, and this is spooky season, so I'm always in the mood for it. But Irish authors tend to be better at it in my experience. They set their stories in Ireland, obviously.
Spooky place.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the thing. Like, a lot of the American authors write thrillers and horror books in places that they know. That's what people do. You write where you know.
Right.
And so you write in America, but America's history is not as vast, and Irish history is so massive that it's inherently scarier.
Right.
It's inherently known to be more haunted or have more of the... I mean, there's more dead people on the island of Ireland than there are in Connecticut, for instance. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
there's just more people have died there. And I think that leads a lot to the spookiness of it, but it's set on an island off the coast of Ireland that's so reclusive that, you know, I don't know, there's like 50 people who live on the island and nobody ever leaves. It's just a spooky book. It's probably the only horror book I've ever read where I actually like kind of got shivers while reading.
All right.
And I was like, wow, this is a good book. So yeah, I think it's the only horror. It is the only horror in my top 5.
Okay. Number 3 for me is going to be Ready Player One.
Okay.
I didn't initially have... So I read it before the movie came out.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know they were making a movie when I read it. I didn't have high expectations for the book, but I thought that the concept of it was good because I had seen a Japanese anime television show basically about the same premise. So I was like,
Okay.
I'll pick it up. And hopefully it's good. The show that I watch is called Sword Art Online. It's basically the same premise. Like, you can... the basic premise of the book is that people can now, like, go online virtually, but, like, their consciousness can be transmitted online.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Sword Art Online, it's more of like it's one setting. It's fantasy.
Okay.
In Ready Player One, it's more of a every culture sort of thing where you can be anything you want, not just fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the book because it sort of delves into some of the problems with gamer culture. It delves into a lot of stuff that... like 80s retro stuff that is really cool that, like, you know, we grew up in the 80s and the 90s, so that's kind of our jam.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up really liking the book. Like, probably one of the fastest books I've ever read.
Really?
Like, yeah. I burned through that book.
Okay.
And then it also encouraged me to buy the sequel, which came out recently, which is Ready Player 2.
Did you read that one?
I did read that one.
Okay.
Also a good book. But I wouldn't put it in my top 5. I wouldn't put it in my top 5. So, yeah, Ready Player One, number 3.
All right. My 3 delves into a little bit of the fantasy realm and was not on my top 5 until I realized it really needs to be. And that's A Storm of Swords, which is the 3rd book in the Game of Thrones series by George R.R. Martin.
Okay.
And the Game of Thrones series, I mean, we talked about it a little bit. You only had gotten through, you know, half of book 1 because of the multiple characters' perspectives. And I think that actually helped me through that book. I don't always love that process. But for Game of Thrones, the entire series, I mean, what's been published so far at least, the multiple characters' perspectives, I think, made me get through it even quicker than I would have normally, because I was so invested in certain characters that I'd speed through 2 or 3 chapters of other characters to get back to the story arc I wanted. It was one of those books that I would bring, I mean, the whole series was a set of books that I'd bring with me to work and read when I had a break.
Yeah,
I read it constantly. But Storm of Swords specifically is the one with an arc where the character Tyrion has a little bit more development, the character Arya has a little bit more development, and I don't want to give anything away for anybody who hasn't read or seen and wants to, as to what their arc was in that book, but specifically I liked the development of those 2 characters in that book, and that I think really made me fall in love with those 2 characters when I didn't really care for them initially.
Right.
So I enjoyed that book thoroughly.
Did you find that the book was different than the show?
As a series, yes, the show departs from the series. Not only because the series ended and the books have not yet. I actually looked it up before this. It's actually supposed to be 7 books is the series. So I'm actually waiting on 2 more books.
Oh my god!
Not just one.
He's not gonna finish another book.
He's not going to finish the 6th book, let alone the 7th. The man will die before that happens, and that's the biggest tragedy in my mind because the books departed from the series, and because, I mean, I think a lot of people think that the series didn't exactly do all the characters justice. So George R. R. Martin has the capacity to correct that in a written story beforehand, and maybe that's why it's taking longer, because the show obviously took his direction. He was a co-writer on most of the episodes, so it clearly was going at least mostly in the direction he intended the books to go to.
Right.
But it did make differences in what happened story-wise, and I want to see how those differences would have panned out. Like, they're not major differences necessarily, but they're differences enough where I'm like, I wonder where that was going. Like,
Yeah.
there was a tweak enough that you're like, that must mean something, or you wouldn't have bothered to change it in the show.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to see the end of that, and I'm never going to see the end of it. The best I can hope for is that George R. R. Martin has created some sort of a rubric or an outline or a rough idea that's on paper somewhere that says where he wanted it to go.
Right.
And they hire some ghostwriter to finish it when he dies. And at least maybe they can do him justice.
Yeah.
That's probably the best I'll get. Honestly, at this point, by the time it comes out, I might not even care about the story anymore, because it'll be so long. But yeah, Storm of Swords, book 3.
All right.
Should roughly match up with season 3 of Game of Thrones, but I haven't watched that specific season recently, so I can't confirm.
The only reason I asked is because I was thinking about it while you're talking, and the Ready Player One book and the Ready Player One movie are very different.
Are they?
Yes.
Okay.
Things happen in the book that don't happen in the movie, and vice versa.
Okay.
And some of the major plot is still the same.
Yep.
But some of the ways they get there are totally different.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're interested in Ready Player One, the book or the movie, just know that they're not the same.
Yeah. I think that when I mean, this is a tangent, but I think that when you are reading or watching something that is in both mediums and you're doing both of them, I think you do have to go into whichever one's second in your mind as a whole different story and not expect it to be the same, or you're just going to be disappointed. Whether you read it first and then watch, or whether you watch first and then read, I think no matter what, that second medium is going to feel lesser to you, simply because you already have your mind set. You have your ideals of what was good and bad about what you saw first.
Yeah.
So, and it's so hard to do. It's so hard to do. I'm very much somebody who will not read the thing if I've already watched a show or a movie. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna read it first if I have any interest in that whatsoever. But I try to wait a good length of time between reading and watching, so that some of the minor things that maybe matter to you while you're reading maybe fall by the wayside if you wait 6 months before watching something.
All right. We'll move on to number 2. So my number 2 book is going to be The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers.
Okay. Which I don't do Lord of the Rings. It's not my jam. What number is that?
So that's book number 2 in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's also movie number 2.
Okay.
And I like it because I like Tolkien. However, sometimes his writing is very detailed. Like,
yeah, I mean, he's very similar to like George R. R. Martin's style, but it's very dry. It's very hard to read sometimes.
And the Two Towers is sort of action packed.
Okay.
And you get all the origin stuff is out of the way. Mm-hmm. And the characters are like all in the middle of their adventure. Mm-hmm. And that's sometimes how I like it. And the I don't remember the name of the place they're defending. Fuck. There's a point in the book. I'm gonna have to edit the shit out of this. There's a point in the book where the main characters basically get trapped in a siege.
Okay.
And I don't know if is there still spoilers for Lord of the Rings?
I don't know.
I don't think so. Anyway, everyone except for Frodo and Sam basically gets trapped in a siege. And they're trying to defend one of the human kingdoms. And it's just like one of the best written action pieces that there is.
All right.
You know, there's a lot of plot development. It doesn't feel like a middle book.
Okay.
It feels like it's you could read it as a standalone thing because once again, Tolkien does so much detail and depth
Right.
into everything that I mean, there's new characters being introduced too. It's not like you're just hanging out with the same people from the last book. But yeah, and any of the Lord of the Rings honestly could be on that list, but the Two Towers is the one that I like the most.
See, I would argue that for most series or trilogies or any multi-book stories, that the first book is probably never on a top list.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I would choose like Return of the King over Fellowship.
Yeah, like the first books in most series typically just have so much either world building or exposition to like kind of set you up. Multiple book stories are long by design. That's why you have multiple books, right? That's the whole point. And so the authors devote a lot of time into setting up where you're at and who these people are and what they're doing and what their drives are. So normally in my experience, book 1 is all about that.
Yeah, yeah.
And while it's good and it's necessary to get through the story, sometimes it's also kind of boring in retro, like after you look at the whole story as a whole.
Yeah.
Book 1 is typically nothing happening.
Yeah.
Nothing major happening. I suppose Game of Thrones is the except. I mean, not Game of Thrones. Hunger Games. Well, Game of Thrones too. There's a lot happening in book 1 of Game of Thrones.
It does.
But I think that's just George R.R. Martin in general. But I was gonna say, Hunger Games is a good exception to that. Hunger Games, like the first book, could be its own book. Like, could be its just standalone book. It doesn't need a book 2 or 3.
That's true.
Book 2 and 3 are good. I enjoyed them, but book 1 could be its own story completely.
I remember the name of the place. It's called Helm's Deep. So for all the Lord of the Rings fans out there who said that
you didn't actually read it and you're just a poser.
And Amanda can attest, I didn't Google anything.
He did not Google anything.
So yeah, the Defense of Helm's Deep is it's one of the best movie action scenes, and it's one of the best written action pieces in a book.
We are going to need a whole podcast on very specific books and their film adaptations, film or TV adaptations, and what our impressions are of that. Because I feel like that could be a ranking in and of itself.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And there's so many of them.
There are.
There's so many of them.
Everything is a movie nowadays.
Well, yeah, that's all they're doing. That's all the movie makers are doing is making books into movies, which I'm okay with because there's so many books that I read that I'm like, God, I would love to see this visually. That's not just in my head movie.
Yeah.
What's
your number 2?
My number 2 is such a cliche for a white middle-aged woman. Such a cliche. And you know what? I'm okay with that. It's book 2 of the Court of Thorns and Roses series. So it's A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, and it's like the most popular thing right now ever. And you know what? There's a reason. It's freaking good. It's a true just fantasy, romance, romantasy, whatever category you want to throw it into. And book 2 is the one where there's so many twists in it and you just can't put it down. You're like, I can't believe this is happening right now.
All right.
And I highly recommend anybody who likes a really good romance, especially a spicy romance, definitely read that series. And book 2 is where it starts to get really awesome.
All right. So we're up to the top.
So before we reveal our number ones,
okay,
I would like to point out that you're 50-50 split between nonfiction and fiction.
That's true. I am.
You've got a good little smattering, although both of your nonfictions are political related, and that's kind of boring. But whatever. I mean, all of mine are clearly fiction, but I've got, a horror, 2 fantasy, and 2 romance, because the Court of Mist and Fury is both fantasy and romance.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So
all right.
I got a few honorable mentions. I was going to put in the Hamilton biography, but I didn't. I liked it. It's a very long book, and at points it is kind of dry because it's like literally just history.
Yeah.
But it was a good book.
I would have to one-up you and say that instead of reading that one, you should read, I think it's My Dearest Hamilton?
Oh, yeah.
Which is the historical nonfiction. Is it? Well, fiction. I think it's fiction. It's got to be fiction. It's historical fiction, but it's adapted from Eliza's diaries of the life of Hamilton and her. So it only has really when she comes into the picture. So it doesn't have his early shit. Mm-hmm. But But that became more entertaining because it was a story. It was created into a fiction story, but it had a lot of notes that came from the autobiography.
Oh, and the author's name is Ron Chernow. I have it right here. It's a
It's a thick book.
There's a pile of books holding my microphone together, so that's one of them. Because it's a thick one. So.
All right, number one.
So number one for me is going to be George Orwell's 1984.
You know, I've never read that book.
You've never read 1984?
I've never read that book. It's one of the many classics that I've never read.
It's a really good book. However, the book is filled with so much like dread and like the book is filled with so many negative emotions because of what the characters in the book are going through. That sometimes it's like a difficult read because you're like, God.
Like depressed from it?
Yeah, like this dystopian nightmare is the worst dystopian nightmare. There was a movie adaptation made in 1984 during the time period that the book suggests, which is pretty interesting. It's not a very good movie. You can
were there a lot of very good movies from the 80s?
I don't know, maybe a couple.
But not a lot. I'm not saying there's none.
Well, this one, so the setting of the book is like England 1984, but it's a dystopian fascist England.
Okay.
So like the production value seems right, but it also seems very cheap. Like everything is very bland because they're trying to put you in this environment where, you know, everything's kind of the same. There's no windows in the buildings and stuff like that. Like, you know, you live in this sort of like permanent just sort of depression. And that's the movie kind of gives you that sense, and so does the book. And the main, you're following one character. He's just like a cog in the wheel in the system. And 1984 spoilers?
Yeah, I haven't read it yet.
Oh, you haven't read it? Are you gonna read it?
I don't know, maybe.
Jeez.
When did they come out? There's still spoilers for like 50 years ago.
I know, right? Anyway.
Stop trying to spoil everyone's books.
I'm not trying to spoil everyone's books. Anyway, it's a good read. If you like all the current dystopian books, 1984 is like one of the progenitors of like dystopian science fiction.
And see, that's something that I read, so you should probably not spoil it for me.
All right. Yeah, if you read it, you'll get what I'm talking about. It's just like Orwell is very good at portraying like a sense of dread in books.
Okay.
Or a sense of like oppression.
Okay.
And that's what the whole book is about.
Okay. I have an interesting homework assignment for us, but I will come up with it later.
Okay.
I will say it before we are off here so that it's said to the network.
I can always edit later, but that's fine.
No, it has to be said to our network.
Okay.
All right.
So what's your number one?
My number one has been my number one since high school. It has never not been my number one. And I suppose I should probably reread it now that I'm not in my 20s or younger anymore.
You're not a teenage girl anymore.
Not a teenage girl anymore, although I feel like it's probably going to do the same thing. I did start to reread it the other day on my Kindle because I was like, I don't know what else to read. This is on here. I'll read it, but whatever. It is Message in a Bottle by Nicholas Sparks. And it is by far my favorite Nicholas Sparks book. It is about, all Nicholas Sparks books are a love story, but this one specifically is someone who is in the Cape and they find a message in a bottle on the beach and they become pen pals with this person and eventually fall in love because it's a Nicholas Sparks book. It was the first book that made me cry. I was in high school, so I probably hadn't read so many sad things by then. I don't remember. But it's what made me fall in love with Nicholas Sparks. It was, I don't know what number book that was of his that I read. It's probably 2 or 3 because it was right around the time. Actually, it might have been middle school. It was around the time A Walk to Remember had come out. in a movie, and it got me interested in his writing. I didn't like A Walk to Remember as a book at all. I thought the movie was better. But Message in a Bottle was fantastic. Now, Message in a Bottle they did also make into a movie because I swear at this point Nicholas Sparks has, I don't know, 30 probably or 40 different books at this point. He publishes a book almost every year. And they've gotten kind of sloppy, in my opinion. I still buy them and I still read them, but they've become a bit more predictable now because he's doing them every year. It's kind of a cherry-picked rubric of love story.
He's got his own style and his own tropes at this point.
Yeah, he does. And so they've become a little bit boring. But the OG Nicholas Sparks books, before he became super famous with everything being turned into a movie, they're some of his best work, in my opinion, the older stuff. I'm like thinking of Bend in the Road and The Rescue. Like they're just really good books by him. But Message in a Bottle is my favorite. Regardless, they did make Message in a Bottle into a movie. I forget who played in it. I want to say, it was famous people too. I can't remember at all. But I hated it. I hated the movie. It doesn't mean that it's bad. I think because it's my favorite book of all time that I hold it to a really high standard.
So on a scale of like Safe Haven to The Notebook, like where does it rank?
In movies?
In movies, yeah.
Do you think Safe Haven's bad?
I think it's not great. I think it's a bit campy.
I think you're a bit campy. I don't think Safe Haven's a bad movie.
You think Safe Haven's a good movie?
I think it's a good movie. I think it's a good adaptation of the book. I think Message in a Bottle as a movie is unwatchable.
Okay.
And I almost want to I think maybe you should watch it. Because I wonder if from a lens of someone who's not read the book and doesn't love the book as much as I love the book, I wonder if it is a better movie than I'm giving it credit for. But I couldn't remember it anymore right now, I would say, because it's probably been a good 10 or 15 years since I've read it again. And I have read this book multiple times, 4, 5, 6 times at least when I was younger. So at a point when I watched the movie, I knew every detail of this book, and every little thing that they got wrong would anger me.
All right.
So I feel like I should probably give it another try, but I don't want to because I love the book so much.
All right. So yeah, that's our top 5 list.
Now, here is a fun little assignment that I think might be interesting.
Okay.
I think we should each read each other's number 1. Because I know you've never read Message in a Bottle, and I've never read 1984.
That'd be interesting.
Right? And now I know that you're not going to love Message in a Bottle, so I don't have any hopes by that, because you don't read romance. Ever.
Not
Ever.
Really. I mean, I'm accidentally reading it currently. But...
Yeah, The 5 Broken Blades. Yeah, because you didn't know that was going to be a romance, which was funny.
I read the back of the book. I was like, oh, this is cool. And then the front cover looked cool. I was like, oh, I'm going to read this book.
Here's the funniest part of that, right? When we were at the bookstore and you bought that book, I had passed by the table that it was there, and I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. Or looked interesting, I should say. And I picked it up and I read about it, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. But it's set in an Asian country.
Fictional Asian country.
Oh, okay, it's a made-up one?
Yeah, it's a made-up one.
But, samurais and ninja things are typically not my jam, so I put it down and I walked away.
That's 100% my jam.
I know it is. But then, a week later, it was my fantasy romance book club that's like, oh, you should read this book next. And I was like, oh, Tim just bought a fantasy romance. I wonder if he knows that.
I do not. I did not.
But you're liking it.
I do like it. It's not fairies, so it's fine.
I'm just saying, maybe you should try another fantasy romance. They're not all fairies. Sometimes there's vampires. Just saying. Or werewolves.
I'm not reading Twilight.
Twilight, there was a book on Twilight, from Twilight, that was on my top 5 for a minute. And then I realized George R. R. Martin was a lot better.
So let's what are you going to read next? What's next on your TBR list?
My next exciting book that I'm looking forward to reading on my TBR. My TBR list is 60 books. But the next one that I plan on reading is Society of Lies, because we are in spooky season, and it's a thriller mystery. It's by Lauren Ling Brown, and Goodreads has it at just under a 4 out of 5, but it's supposed to be really good, and I don't know. We'll see what happens. It's not set in Ireland, so, it would be down a few notches from obviously the whistling, but I'll give it a try. See what happens. The book cover is pretty, and according to the little sticker on the front, it's in Reese Witherspoon's book club, so who knows? It'll be the next fad thing, I'm sure.
Reese Witherspoon's book club, huh?
Yeah, I didn't even know she had one.
All right.
I think everybody gets one now.
The book I'm going to read next, and it's probably not going to be for like a month, but
Why?
Because it's going to take me forever to get through 5 Broken Blades.
Yeah, you don't read as often as I do, or as long as I do.
No, I have ADD, so reading is sometimes.
But you could start it while you're reading 5 Broken Blades.
I don't want it. That'll be so confusing.
Listen, I'm not getting through those tandem reads before I start Society of Lies. I ain't got that kind of time. I'm reading Society of Lies next week.
Anyway, I bought it most recently. It's called The Blade Itself. It's part of a series, but it's book 1, and
you don't do series.
I know, but it sounded cool, so I'm gonna give it a shot. I know nothing about it yet, except the name of the book is The Blade Itself, and it's got a cool cover.
Did you judge the book by its cover?
No, I did read the first chapter, but I totally forgot it. So,
all right.
So it's been like a few weeks since we bought it. Sorry, since I bought it. So I forgot the first chapter.
How many books are in the series?
I think 3.
Okay. That's a big commitment for you.
And it's a thick book.
Is it?
Yeah.
How
it's that red book up there.
They can't see that.
I know, it's an audio podcast, I get it. It's got to be at least 300 or 400 pages.
That's like a day and a half.
That's not a day and a half. That's like a whole month.
It's a whole month. Listen, the tandem read is a whole month, and that's really not a whole month. It's so boring. I don't know how people do it. I'm literally powering through this because I hear that book 8 of this series is to die for, and it's going to give me all the feels, and I'm waiting for it. But if it doesn't give me all the feels, Sarah J. Maas is dead to me. And the only good series she has is A Court of Thorns and Roses, and I will fight you for it.
All right, well,
let's see what happens. Let's see if it's actually a hot take or if they redeem themselves.
That's it for this episode of the Book Revolution podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever streaming platform you're listening to us on. And leave a nice comment. And recommend it to your friends.
They should also tell us what books they want us to.
Oh, yeah.
Give us recommendations. Tell us what books are hot and popular.
In the comment section or however you find us. Give us a book recommendation.
All genres are open. I may not read them all, but whatever I don't read, Tim will read, and vice versa.
Yeah. And, we'll have socials set up at some point, so you can find us easier. But for now, just leave a comment on, I don't know, Apple Podcasts or whatever you're listening to.
Are you going to edit that, or are you just going to make it sound like that? Because it just sounds ridiculous.
I'm just going to make it sound ridiculous.
You are ridiculous.
All right. See you next time. Bye.